Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm going to continue with the next case study, Belarus. Reading both key terms of the conference, one thing automatically about discussions in academic fields concerning different constructions of art history. I have been asking to concentrate on art history in Belarus, and when I was preparing for this paper, I realized probably it is a special study case when one can't use so easily the common theories. White places and black holes. This enumeration referring to Belarus might be continued with terra incognita, in between, territory of nowhere, or the title of an exhibition of Belarusian art in Ukraine in 2005 announced The Empire's Swamps. The question underlying the conference, how the lesser-known regions have been and are reflected in the global history of art, is easy to answer for Belarus. In global history of art, Belarus doesn't exist at all. Belarusian art history, especially in the 20th and 21st century, still contains various blind spots in need to be reviewed. Only if Belarusian art is explored internally, it can find its place in global art history. I would like to sketch a brief outline of the Belarusian art history in the context of political developments, depicting the cartography of the blind spots. I'm going to point out why art from Belarus was never strongly perceived outside the country and even couldn't be perceived. In summary, I will frame thoughts on strategies to make visible. Also, I will introduce some artistic works, since a conference is an opportunity to make artists and their works known to a wider audience. Over the centuries, Belarus was a part of various political state formations, Lithuanian, Polish, Russian. Belarusian national state is a product of the early 20th century. Not one of the many religions in the multicultural region, but the language was a constitutive component of the Belarusian national state. Culture studies and ethnographic practice influenced its formation and the determination of its borders in 1919. In 1919, Marc Chagall established a folk art school in Vitebsk, his native town, which was a part of Russia until 1924. He was followed by Kazimir Malevich, Lisitsky, Nikolai Suetin, Ilya Chashnik. They founded the Art Association Unovis, which Karl Schlögl defined as a highly productive laboratory of the modern age. Malevich transformed the folk art school into the center of suprematism. The school existed for 3 years. Up to the 90s, Unovis and the work of the teachers and students of the folk art school were not part of the official Soviet art history. If the art of avant-garde was mentioned in Belarus at all, then as aberration that needed to be overcome. The artist education curriculum in Belarus was not connected to that art. As in the whole Soviet Union, Stalinism in Belarus meant a break that strongly influenced and hindered the development of art. Apart from this brief episode of the avant-garde, we still know little about the art scene in Belarus until the beginning of the Second World War. Individual artistic positions that have been studied only in recent years have slowly come to be known to the Belarusian public, but they are internationally unknown due to lack of translation. As example, this artist visionary Josep Drazdovich, who is locally called a Belarusian Leonardo da Vinci. Already in the 30s, he was enthusiastic about the cosmos and presented in his pictures his ideas of the life in universe. He painted life on Mars and life on the moon. He designed, detailed a spaceship and published in 1931 a book on astronomy. He died in 1954, destitute and unknown. We know little about the life and work of the artist in Belarus during the Great Patriotic War. The Belarusian artist collaboration with the German occupiers has been subject to research only in part, handed down only early or not at all explored. Most propaganda posters of the occupying power were of course made by local designers and are not of the best quality. But it is also supposed that there were also artists who created portraits and other commissioned works for Wehrmacht officers. This collaboration was not an obstacle for the career of graphic designers and artists after the war. The Great Patriotic War, with its millions of victims, the partisan, the resistance, and the victory of the Belarusian people, is an issue loaded with taboos until today. Contemporary artists who deal with history critically risk a scandal at least, sometimes even persecution. As for example, Andrei Lenkevich. For his series Double Heroes, he took photos of members of a society who are collecting old war uniforms. Lenkevich shows how the modern Belarusian identity is built on the Soviet identity and how the heroic victory in the Great Patriotic War is exploited without question in order to create it. I have chosen his work for my exhibition West of East in the Gallery for Contemporary Art U last year in Minsk. Despite the many explanations, as you can see, despite guided tours, we both found ourselves during the opening in the next days in the middle of a hostile crowd. After the years of reconstruction following the Second World War, the University of Arts was founded in Minsk in 1953. Most teachers were trained classically, academically, and shared the principles of socialist realism. The ideological indoctrination by the Communist Party was ubiquitous. Slight deviations from postulated optimism themes, stylistic deviations from realistic representation were still tolerated and could even be rewarded. So is this painting by Mikhail Savitsky, The Partisan Madonna. It was showed in the Union exhibition 1967 in Moscow and was bought afterwards by Moscow Tretyakov Gallery. The issue of the Great Patriotic War was understandably important and compliant, but Savitsky referred moreover to the modernism, or more precisely to the modernist artists who were close to communism, as Renato Guttuso in Italy or Diego Rivera from Mexico. But in case of radical renunciation of ideological issues and realism, artists were excluded from exhibitions, equaling a public non-existence, like Israel Basov. Art criticism agitated against modernism, and so the audience was able to learn indirectly about modernism. Campaigns against artists filled the media. Artists have been accused of distorting the history, misrepresenting the reality and the formalism. Marc Chagall was decried as a traitor. Even in the 80s, it was a discussion in the press if Chagall was worth an entry in the great encyclopedic dictionary in Belarus. And by the way, with the same ignorance and not perception, all artists that had immigrated from Belarus were punished until 2010. The Sovietization was extended to all culture and social areas. In the era of stagnation from the late 60s to the early 80s, complicated issues of Belarusian history before 1919 were cleaned or concealed. Numerous historical architectural buildings were destroyed or left to decline and decay. In reaction to this policy, the artists deliberately turned to historical heritage. In paintings and in graphic arts, historical landscapes were represented, building of the past, artifacts of whole culture. Thus, we can explain this extreme non-simultaneity of the art development in Belarus compared with other Soviet republics and socialist countries around Belarus. At the same time, When the group of conceptual artists Коллективное действие in Moscow exercised its performative practices outdoors and extracted itself from the official art scene. When Edward Krasinsky in Poland drafted his blue line through rooms with tape, in Belarus emerged images of dilapidated castles and more rural idols. Pictures that seemed to be sweet landscape painting at first were a silent resistance, an attempt to establish a culture of remembrance in the context of political developments. This doesn't mean there couldn't have been a more pronounced counterculture, but if one existed between 1950 and 1980, it's still unknown and a blind spot in the Belarusian art history. From the 80s to the middle of the 90s, the art scene in Belarus experienced a short period of real and felt momentum. New autonomous artist groups emerged, numerous exhibitions took place at unusual venues, many trips abroad, contacts and exchanges with colleagues were taking shape. The exhibition Belarusian Avant-Garde, 80s, 90s, in 2010 in Minsk, that was mainly based on works from a private collection, gave the movement a name. In fact, many artists now refer to classic modernism in the Vitebsk or Novice. For example, artist Lyudmila Rusova in her performance Casimir Resurrection. Chagall was rehabilitated during the perestroika also and rose to a national pop idol. I teach at the European Humanities University, the Belarusian University in exile in Lithuania, in Vilnius, and together with students and colleagues, we are preparing an anthology of the Belarusian unofficial art of the 80s. In fact, I question myself the international output of art from Belarus during this period. Today, the international cooperation of Belarusian artist scene can be hardly understood and reconstructed. The exhibitions were often organized quickly and documented inadequately. The scientific elites in the museums of the former Soviet republics have been replaced completely, which makes it difficult to receive information about Belarusian exhibitions there in the 80s. If museums in the former Soviet republics still archive Belarusian artworks from this period, they are not presented to the public. International network with fellow artists, art historians, curators, or art critics didn't take place. From today's perspective, the naivety of lack of professionalism of the Belarusian actors, inexperienced in market economy, becomes apparent. Often they were advised by dubious art dealers and curators. And I must admit that the international output of this momentum in the Belarusian art scene remained marginal. In the 80s, the institutionalization and organization of contemporary art in Belarus after the proclamation of independence didn't take place. The Soros Foundation did also work in Belarus for several years, but in contrast to other post-communist countries, its presence in Belarus didn't lead to the establishment of a center for contemporary art. Anyhow, the center strongly promoted the emergence of non-state initiatives as well as an international network of artists and curators. Also geopolitically, Belarus remained indefinable for Western recipients. Is it Russia, Central, East Central Europe? And wasn't accepted by funding institutions for exhibitions and research projects. In the emerging economic logic of funding for art and culture, it's difficult to find a section for art from Belarus. This led to the fact that art from Belarus was not represented in many large, solid, widely perceived projects which started with a repositioning of Eastern European art, like Irwin's East Art Map. After the war, art and culture in post-communist Europe is the only exception that comes to my mind. Contemporary Belarusian art production as well, being terra incognita, is closely related to the political developments of the last 20 years. Since 80 years, Belarus has been ruled by the authoritarian president Lukashenko. 18 years of his rule have had a continued effect on the Belarusian artistic scene. In the state art institutions and in the education at the academy, a conservative traditionalist art concept dominates. The infrastructure of non-commercial and alternative art venues was destroyed, and their development has been hampered. On the other hand, culture in Belarus today, and above all art, is the only area left to express oneself somewhat openly. Here, connection with individual art projects, important socio-political topics can be addressed and discussed. Interest in young people can be reached in positions opposing the strong state ideological pressure can be expressed. The last year was already characterized by a high number of lectures, workshop discussions, and artist presentations organized by small initiatives. International organizations and foundations have fortunately recognized the democratic potential of free art and culture in Belarus in recent years. Their support is absolutely essential for the independent art scene in Belarus. Also, their activity is officially banned, and the Belarusian recipients of their money risk legal persecution. The debates on the two-voiced history of European art are ubiquitous at the latest since Hans Belting, The End of Art History. Roland Prügel asked correctly whether art history in Europe, anticipated as bivocal, could be replaced by a polyphonic model. However, this question is completely irrelevant in terms of Belarusian art history, as long as its own blind spots are not processed. As long as slightly refreshed editions of art history from the Soviet era are still published, leading around the gaps with jumps in the description. As long as they thread one artifact to another, monotonous and purely descriptive without contextualizing them. A local art history cannot be perceived in polycentric and multivocal context as long as no one has knowledge of it. What is not explored, not published, and not translated, what is not imparted by international networks, doesn't exist. The widely accessible knowledge may also influence the perception of a local art history. No one has to love Belarusian landscape paintings from the 60s and 70s with storks and churches. But if we know they were created in time of struggles against religion and the destruction of historical architecture, and those were gestures of protest, we would no longer see them as an expression of local socialist frumpiness. The comparison of official and unofficial art practices in socialism definitely could be enriched by case studies from Belarus. For contemporary art in Belarus under present political conditions, international support, guidelines allowing this support, and opportunities to break up the inner isolation of the local art scene are desirable. Because art in and from Belarus by no means is limited to territorial and cultural codes. Just whether art rises its own story on a meta level, it inserts into the sphere of common meanings and forms of expressions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lena. This is fascinating stuff. And I'm sure we'll have some questions about this paper. We seem to be coming across lots of black holes this afternoon. You are?
When we heard just in the conference just before that many artists live because of non-reception in their country, I know at least one Belarus artist in Germany, that is Marina Napushkina, and she works only about the state of Belarus and Lukashenko. And I think this perhaps should also be something that we take into consideration, that people who are really engaged politically about a state which is dictatorial, like the one of Lukashenko, has only the possibility to express itself if it goes abroad. And she is commenting daily, since years, Lukashenko's politics, taking protesting against it as art, with her paintings, drawings, network, homepage, and so on. So maybe you don't know it, but I think it would be interesting to also consider these artists which have had to go and which are really working about the state.
I don't know what to say. I know her very well. I invite her also in my exhibitions. She has a very good homepage, Office for Antipropaganda.com, I think, .com. Probably she's the famous artist coming from Belarus now, but it was a huge wave of immigration in the 90s from Belarus, and there are a lot of artists based in Amsterdam, in Düsseldorf, and in Berlin. Yeah, the way Marina Naprushkina works couldn't be possible in Belarus. But what is good and what have been changed in the last years, that there appear possibilities in Belarus to present her works in Minsk, for example. She have been twice presented or 3 times presented in Minsk, and there is also very good discussion in social media and on the art platform Art Activist based in Belarus, discussion with her about her art, about her impact on art in Belarus. And yeah, it is an important artist for our context, but I think also for the so-called global context, because here issue is not only this dictatorship, but also how we or how Europe and also called democracy, how it is dealing with it.
Everybody keeps telling me, don't go, it's dangerous. So how much is, you know, the situation kept out, you know, critics, and how is that affected? I mean, is that could it be a positive thing that they're going more inward and not looking so much towards globalization because of this extended isolation they have due to your political situation? Could that be positive in some way?
Could you precise your answer, your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm a critic and I want to go to Belarus, and I've
Yeah.
been warned not to. So I'm just giving you an example of maybe you have less, you know, less exchange from the outside coming in, and how does that affect the art? Maybe going inward and not being so exposed to the global, what's going on in the global scene, is a positive thing as well. I mean, you showed like some work about that, but in a general reflection, I'd like to get your...
Now, the interesting thing in Belarus, probably, in my opinion, is that every 2 years you have the new situation. Probably because of political issues, probably of new ideas of president and so on and so on. So 3 years ago, it was difficult to organize an exchange between artists, between critics and so on. last year it worked very well. There were a lot of exhibitions, a lot of lectures in Minsk with guests from the whole world, and also for artists and cultural operators it's possible to come to Western Europe. So now this connections or relationship is very intensively, but I can't say what it'd be next year.
But is that officially controlled? In an official way, I could go, but unofficially, it's not, is subject to control and therefore more risky. I mean, is that how they keep control? They do arrange certain exchanges in an official manner.
Yes, sometimes yes. If somebody didn't get a permission to leave the country, we see this control. But it is the usual and normal way of working of security services like KGB in Belarus that they don't publish in newspapers that they try to control all spheres of cultural life. So we have our ideas in which way and whom they are controlling, but it's difficult to say.
Thank you very much, Lena. There are no more questions, I guess.
Thank you.
Before you go for your 15-minute coffee break, I just would like to inform you that you have another option, and that